Welcome back to Staying in My Lane podcast. Today's topic is postpartum depression, postpartum rage, pregnancy rage, and postpartum psychosis. I'm going to share my story, my personal experience of postpartum depression. I'm going to talk about facts, statistics, and I'm going to talk about postpartum depression in fathers, which I did not know was a thing until I really started deep diving into this topic more. I'm going to talk about how we can support mothers who are going through postpartum, because as a mother who's been through postpartum depression, how that looked for me and what that support looked like for me in my first marriage versus my second marriage, which was a night and day difference. And so, kind of looking at how society views postpartum depression, the stigma surrounding that, and how us as mothers can find that support and get through those hard times, heal our mind, heal our bodies for ourselves, but also for our children and our babies, and be able to show up and be present in the moment. So, what is postpartum depression? Postpartum depression is a form of depression that occurs after childbirth, and it's characterized by that persistent sadness, anxiety, fatigue that often makes it difficult to care for yourself or your baby. And before we get too much into the topics, I want to distinguish this from just having baby blues. And baby blues is pretty common. I don't know if it's necessarily called baby blues anymore, but that's a more mild form of depression, which typically resolves in anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. And that's that transitioning period into welcoming that new baby, transitioning back into your home with your new baby, getting back into a routine, and kind of getting settled into your new normal. Whereas postpartum depression can take months to years to resolve and heal from. And I bet you did not know that there is such thing as postpartum depression for fathers, which is also called paternal postpartum depression. I did not know about this until I started doing research for this episode. So before we get into postpartum with moms, I just want to go ahead and address the paternal postpartum depression that I researched on. And like I said, this is something that I had never heard of before. And after reading about it, I started thinking about how society views men and how society views women when a child is born. And, it's easy for us in society and as humans to tend to gravitate and support the mom because she is the one that, gave birth, and she's the one that is most of the time the primary caretaker for the baby when coming home from the hospital. But then I started questioning how men are feeling, because that is a big transition for moms and dads. And sometimes I think it's easy to forget that men also need that same support. They need that same validation and recognition just as much as women and mothers do. Because we always say we feel bad for the moms, we want to support the moms. The moms are so tired and they do so much. But I think it's important to recognize that fathers do a lot too. And we don't take the time always to stop and say, hey, men can feel the same way. Hey, men might be going through some things too, because, we tend to look at men as the masculine role, the caretaker, the primary breadwinner, and they do a lot to support their families most of the time. And so I think it's really important to recognize that and validate that to them so that they feel that support. And this is something I've talked about on my other podcast episodes. I am someone who wants to recognize my husband. When he goes to work, I tell him thank you. When he does something for me, I tell him thank you. I am very thankful, and I'm very mindful of expressing that gratitude when he does something for me, because I want him to feel recognized. I want him to feel that value coming from me. I want him to feel validated in what he is doing and how he is feeling. And so I think that that's important, to recognize the sacrifice that fathers make. If they are the one that's providing financially, they are having to go to work after the baby is born. So they may miss out on things, that those big milestones or those moments that we have when we bring a new baby home. Fathers may feel depressed, they may feel sad, they may feel anxious, and they may have a hard time accepting that they have to leave and return to work, when in reality they may feel that same need and that same want to be with their baby and their partner. And so when we think about the dads who are bringing home a new baby with their girlfriend, wife, partner, whatever it may be. That's why I used the word partner, because that honestly, a relationship status doesn't even matter. But when we think of these dads who are bringing home a new baby, we think of that dad who's trying to find that work-life balance in the new chapter of their lives together. And so when you hear the word postpartum depression, it's an automatic response for women to think of other women. But paternal postpartum depression has a lot of similar symptoms and feelings as postpartum depression in women. These feelings for men may vary depending on the man, the experience. This can be linked to hormonal changes, the stress of becoming a new parent, the stress of adding another child to their family, and risk factors that increase a father's risk of developing paternal postpartum depression are having a prior history of depression, a prior history of anxiety disorders or mood disorders. And one thing I noticed that was different in men versus women, talking about postpartum here, is that men tend to be more impulsive, whereas women tend to be more emotional. And carrying the stress of financial strain, difficulties is also another risk factor in men for developing that postpartum depression as fathers. And although I think it's really important to check on mothers, I also think that it's really easy to forget about the dads. And I think it's important to stop and think about that. The fathers matter too, and their feelings and what they are going through also matter. And when we think about a couple, right, there's that team dynamic. So as a wife, it's also very important for us to check on our husbands and be able to validate their feelings during postpartum as well. I truly think that society has made it very easy to dismiss men's feelings and emotions. So it's not a normal conversation. It's not a normal thought process for us. And when men do show emotion in society, we tend to think of them as weak. And so then they revert and they stop showing that emotion. Or we forget to ask, or we don't want to ask how they are feeling. So we just don't. I think it's really easy for us to say that our husbands are just in a bad mood and they just are annoyed or they're irritable or whatever. But with it being 2025, I really think it's important to validate the fact that men have feelings, men have emotions, and it is normal for them to have those emotions and feelings. And it is really important that we change the stigma around men's mental health and how they feel, how they express their emotions, and the fact that it is okay for them to feel emotions. Because overall, I just think there's a lack of social support when it comes to men's mental health. So the paternal postpartum depression, that's probably why we don't hear this term very often. Just don't forget to check on the men. Don't forget to check on the fathers, because most likely they're also struggling and they deserve to have that same support. So what about postpartum depression in mothers? Postpartum depression differs from baby blues. And like I said, postpartum depression can last anywhere from a few months to a few years if left untreated. I actually experienced postpartum depression in not just one pregnancy postpartum, but two. And so postpartum depression is something that I experienced with 2 out of my 3 children, which honestly kind of surprises me because during my second pregnancy, I was in the middle of a divorce. I was separated. And if you go back and listen to my past episodes, I talk about the fact that I lived in my car with a newborn and a 3-year-old for a couple weeks in the middle of winter. And weirdly enough, I did not have postpartum depression with that pregnancy. Well, post-baby. So let's start from the beginning. With my first pregnancy, I didn't have many problems with the pregnancy itself. I had a lot of morning sickness and I was very ill. And now knowing more about postpartum depression and what causes it, the stress that I had during my pregnancy and just the amount of things that I was going through at the time, it's not surprising to me now that I experienced postpartum depression looking back on it. But in that moment, I did not know anything about postpartum depression. I did not know what to look for the symptoms or the signs of that. And the symptoms of postpartum depression include things like that persistent sadness, persistent irritability, feelings of overwhelmed and overstimulated, a loss of interest in activities, and feeling that guilt or worthlessness or even difficulty bonding with your baby. which was never something that I personally experienced. However, I have had friends who have experienced that. For me, I experienced a lot of anxiety, a lot of irritability, a lot of guilt and shame, which now looking back, I can contribute a lot of that to the lack of support that I had in my first marriage, and that was my first baby. And I know that not every mother has the support that they desire or they feel like they want after having a baby. But for me, my first two pregnancies, I did not have that support. So I can relate to that. With my third pregnancy, I did. And it was a night and day difference. And for me, that was kind of a shell shock. I didn't know how to accept the help. I felt uncomfortable accepting the help. And I felt guilty accepting and having that support, which honestly, I still don't know why I felt that way, but it's just kind of an interesting thing to talk about because that's something that we all desire and that's something that we all want is to have that support and that love and that family unit. And once I had that, I didn't know how to accept it. I didn't know how to just let it happen. I felt a need to kind of control the situation, and I felt the need to do things independently because I have had to rely on myself for so long. So that was a really big challenge for me during my postpartum of my third pregnancy. During my first pregnancy and after, I have talked about the fact that I was alone doing most of that solo. I was the primary caretaker for my child, and I would get up and change diapers, make bottles. I would do everything. And being a mom who I think I was 22, 23 at the time, and I had just had my first C-section because he was breech, which also made me feel very guilty in the fact that I had to have a C-section because around that time there was a lot of talk about that it's not a real way to give birth, and quite honestly it's very painful. And so it is real, but that was kind of the topic at the time, and people were kind of shaming moms who were having C-sections. So that was also another struggle that I dealt with during my postpartum recovery. I did seek support from a mental health professional. I sought support from my medical professionals. I began to experience a lot of cognitive difficulty concentrating. I was very forgetful. A lot of that now I can look back and see that that lack of support from my partner at the time and the narcissistic abuse that I was experiencing probably was part of that reason that I was having that forgetfulness, and it was almost sending me into a fight or flight mode. But I do kind of put together that a lot of that was because I was married to someone who just didn't want to parent with me and instead just wanted to kind of let me take that lead while he did his own thing. I remember having insomnia for the first time, and I was a girl who could sleep. I could sleep anywhere, anytime. And so that for me was a huge change. And that's something that I didn't know how to deal with. But it's also something that's carried over and has just kind of became part of my life until recently when I've started to lower my cortisol levels and therefore has helped me sleep better at night. But I've had to find supplements now, being 34, as a mom of three children. And I've had to kind of find supplements and routines that work for my life. I've kind of had to make those schedules that work for my life now because I have three children and I'm in a supportive relationship and a marriage now. So that has changed my dynamic when dealing with the stress of motherhood and the stress of just the changes that life brings, right? Adding another baby to our family because my now husband and I have a child together who is now not a baby anymore. And so that change that I felt from not having a supportive husband or a supportive mother-in-law to remarrying and now having a supportive husband, a supportive mother and father-in-law, along with my parents who have always been supportive. And that was a night and day difference for me. I had to learn how to accept that help, like I just talked about a couple minutes ago. And during my pregnancies and my postpartum experiences, that was really different in each pregnancy and each postpartum experience. I had a lot of changes in appetite, and I was sometimes eating more, sometimes eating less. I had at one point been sleeping so much that my energy levels were very, very low, and the fatigue was so intense that I had to rely on my mom and dad to help me, and I had to learn how to accept that help without feeling that guilt or shame. And like I said before, I had a lot of trouble sleeping. During my first pregnancy, I quit eating. I became very sick. I was very depressed in my pregnancy at the end because of having to have the C-section. I was very unhealthy. I was drinking a lot after having my baby. And I think a lot of that was because of the influence that I was around at the time. And I fell into that coping mechanism, which is honestly a very unhealthy coping mechanism in general, let alone after you had a baby. So my go-to was drinking. And I've talked previously on the podcast about how I'm trying to live a sober lifestyle. I'm trying to be healthy. I'm trying to remove alcohol completely from my life, because when I was in a postpartum stage with my children, alcohol was how I coped. And now I realized that that was a very toxic thing for me to turn towards. And that contributed to a lot of my anxiety, a lot of my paranoia, a lot of my depression. And at that time, I did not know about holistic health. I did not know anything about yoga, somatic work, meditation, sound baths, aligning your chakras, and balancing your hormones naturally, not with medication, because that was just something that was not really normalized at the time. And like I said, when I had my first child, being a younger mom, that was something that I felt very alone in my journey of being a new mom and experiencing all these things for the first time, because I also am an only child. So I didn't have a sister or someone to turn to, and I didn't really know how to ask those questions without feeling that guilt or feeling that embarrassment that kind of follows. Whereas fast forward to my third child, I had the support system. I had the most loving and doting husband on this planet who would drive down, because at the time we were living apart. It was right before COVID. We were trying to find a house, which is a whole nother thing with stress. And so I had this husband who would drop everything to support me during my postpartum experience the third time around, which is not something that I had felt really comfortable with, and I didn't know how to accept that help like I talked about. And so I didn't even tell my husband about my postpartum depression feelings, the symptoms that I was experiencing, because I felt so much shame at the time and I didn't want to open up about it or burden him with that. So I kind of took it into my own hands before I had my third baby to kind of set up a plan as far as birth control and medications. I actually was going to have my placenta turned into pills to take after my baby was born so that I could nourish my body back to health holistically and naturally, which if you ever get the chance to do that, I highly recommend that be a route that you take and experience, because it does balance your hormones, it balances your body, it helps you get back mentally and emotionally quicker than just turning towards medication. And like I said, I had a little bit of anxiousness and depression around afterwards because we were living apart. We were trying to find a house. COVID was just kind of starting, and everybody knows how stressful that time was. And so my hormones and my emotions were kind of all over the place at that time. But what I also experienced before postpartum depression with my third pregnancy is pregnancy rage. And pregnancy rage is severe emotional ups and downs, severe mood swings that can be attributed to hormonal changes in the progesterone and the estrogen during pregnancy. I experienced a lot of ups and downs because I was living apart from my husband at the time. I had 2 kids already. I was working, and there was just a lot of stress and a lot of strain that happened in that process of finding a house together. Not to mention, I was also trying to co-parent with a narcissist and an abuser who did not want to co-parent or agree on anything with me, which made my life extremely complicated at that time. I kind of feel like my pregnancy rage was associated a lot with the fact that I was so stressed out and I was experiencing a lot of anger towards my ex-husband and the fact that he made my life a living hell, that a lot of that may have inadvertently came out during my pregnancy as rage and anger towards the wrong person. It was not directed towards the right person. And it wasn't like I was crazy. It just was, like I said, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of mood swings, and just a lot of unpredictable emotions for me at the time because there was so much going on in my life. At the end of my pregnancy with my third child, I was asked by the University of Iowa, where I had my child, to participate in an experimental copper IUD birth control method that would happen during my C-section. I have had 3 C-sections. I've had one with each child, and weirdly enough, my C-sections have gotten easier, not harder, not more complicated. My recovery time with each pregnancy has seemed to go faster every time, and I usually am up walking around within the first 5 hours of having my C-section, which I was very proud of because I did not take any of the pain medication with any of my C-sections afterwards. However, when I signed up for this birth control experiment, and like I said, it was not like some weird experiment. There was a lot of research with it. So I did voluntarily agree that they could place the copper IUD in during my C-section after they took my child out, obviously. And that caused me a lot of problems. I ended up finding out that a lot of my postpartum depression with my third pregnancy was linked to copper toxicity, or copper poisoning, if you want to say it that way, which, moms, please do your research. If you are going to get on birth control, do your research. My third pregnancy and having that postpartum depression, I did not take any medication from a traditional doctor. And I did not even know that I had postpartum depression right away. At the time, I was feeling pretty good, and I thought that things were going to be okay because I had the birth control IUD in, and they told me it was going to be fine. They said not to worry. They said that all the symptoms of that would stop soon. And so as I healed, the symptoms would go away, like cramping, bleeding, things like that. And this is why I stress to always do your research and do it thoroughly. Look through the fine print. Ask not one doctor, but ask multiple doctors. Ask holistic practitioners. Look into other remedies or other ways of doing things. Because when I did this experimental birth control with the copper IUD, I really trusted them to kind of have an idea of what I was getting myself into, and which probably just comes along with being naive and wanting to have that birth control in so you don't have to make a plan later down the road. And this resulted in me having that copper toxicity, which in turn I had to have surgically removed. And when I say surgically removed, it had embedded into a piece of my stomach, and the doctors had to go in and surgically remove this IUD that made its way from my uterus all the way to my digestive tract. Which, by the way, just a little side story, I remember not being completely under anesthesia, but being awake enough to know that the doctor was playing music. And not only was she playing music during my surgical removal of this IUD, she was playing Beauty and the Beast soundtrack. So that almost felt like a horror movie, to be honest. But what we found out when we took out the copper IUD is that the copper toxicity had actually been the reason behind my hormonal imbalances, my hormonal issues, and my postpartum depression. And that was really shocking to me, not only because I had trusted the University of Iowa, which obviously that experiment turned out to be wrong, probably not a great idea, but this also played a really big factor into those hormonal imbalances of that progesterone and that estrogen that I just talked about a little bit ago. And I don't think I mentioned that I had to wait almost a full year after my birth of my daughter to get this IUD removed because they had to wait a certain amount of time for it to settle in wherever it was. And I actually got to look at it after they removed it, and it's just not something I would ever do again. An IUD, honestly, I can say almost ruined my life. It made me so sick. And with this copper toxicity being something that's rare, it can cause neurological issues, that forgetfulness, insomnia, nightmares, and it can actually increase your anxiety as well. And the copper IUD released copper into the uterus. That's the whole point of the IUD, is to prevent pregnancy. So for the copper IUD, it released copper into the uterus. But some people, like me, may experience, or well, had experienced for me, an increased copper level in my blood, which led to that copper toxicity, and aka the copper poisoning. And the likelihood of this copper toxicity from a copper IUD is pretty rare, but I also think it's something that women should be made aware of. That was something that I was not talked about prior to. I did not see anything in the fine print of reading everything before I signed anything. And so it's always really important to do your research, look into everything possible, because even if it's a rare instance, that can happen. And it's just not something that I ever thought I would experience, but I did. And it was really painful. And it contributed to a lot of my postpartum symptoms. When I got the copper IUD taken out, I experienced something called postpartum rage, which is characterized by that kind of the same thing as pregnancy rage, characterized by that extreme and persistent anger, difficulty controlling your temper, aggressive thoughts or behaviors, or feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. That kind of hostility, intrusive thoughts about harming the baby, which is a rare thing that I did not experience, but I do know that that is a reality for some moms, and please seek that help if that is you. Please seek that help if you know somebody who's experiencing that, because that is very scary to feel out of control and to have that outer body experience. Pregnancy rage can actually be followed by postpartum rage, which pregnancy mood swings, that's a normal thing to think about, but those severe mood swings that we talked about, which can start as early as the first trimester and reappear in the third trimester before birth, which therefore after would turn into postpartum rage. And a lot of this can be attributed to the hormonal issues, like I said, those estrogen levels, the progesterone levels that may surge to support that developing pregnancy, and even that postpartum recovery afterwards. And it's totally normal for women to have mood fluctuations, have mood swings during pregnancy. This can happen from the first trimester all the way until postpartum. And those hormonal changes are primary drivers of pregnancy mood swings, which, again, totally normal, but I don't think all these things are talked about in society as a normal conversation. It's not something that mothers feel comfortable coming forward and talking about, because we are so shamed for having those crazy mood swings, or whatever they like to say. But I do think more providers should be having these conversations and educating their patients on the risk factors and the symptoms of postpartum depression, postpartum rage, and pregnancy rage. And let's not forget paternal postpartum depression, which again, I had never heard of until researching for this episode. So when we are thinking about supporting a new parent through the postpartum period, what are some ways to help them through that time period without pressuring them or making them feel smothered by help? Because I have been on the other side of that, where I have not wanted to accept the help because I either felt guilt or shame, or I felt kind of smothered by people who were wanting to help me through that. The first thing that we can do is encourage them to prioritize rest, accept the help without pressuring them, connecting with others, and seek that professional support if needed, which can be a really sensitive conversation. So going about that in a really sensitive manner, being mindful of how the mom is feeling, finding the right time to have that conversation is really important. One of the best things for me in having the support with my third baby was having help from family with meals or household chores, helping with childcare. That allowed me to bond with my third baby. And I've bonded with all three of my children. I should just make that very clear. But having that time to bond with my baby and to be in the moment was so important to me. And it became such a magical time in my postpartum recovery, just being in the moment, enjoying my newborn, while also having my older two children come and spend some time, but be able to also leave to help me get some rest. Was my mom and dad would take care of them, and my husband and I were able to just enjoy that newborn stage, which is something that he had never experienced because this was his first child. And I honestly had never experienced, because my first marriage, my first partnership with that didn't allow for that. So looking back on that, I'm really happy that I had that time, because it allowed us to create some really amazing memories. One of the best things that I did in my third postpartum recovery was when I was trying to balance my hormones after pregnancy, and this includes, all the way after having my copper IUD removed, is I focused on a healthy lifestyle, including a balanced diet, fats and protein, prioritizing sleep, managing stress, and having that meditation, the relaxation techniques, and also seeking that professional help from my medical professionals along the way. And my primary doctor was really, really good about incorporating my holistic health that I was kind of exploring at the time. And I'm really into that more so now, but I was just kind of getting started with that. And so she really took the time to incorporate those techniques and those practices into the modern medicine and the more traditional medicine, which I really appreciated her for. But some things that really helped me during my postpartum recovery was focusing on my nutrition, what I was putting in my body. That's fuel for your body. And I always kind of go off the mindset with your body is so sacred. It is not a dumpster to throw trash in. It is something to fuel your body with nutrients, something that it needs to thrive on. It needs to have in order for you to feel at your best. And so, one thing for me that I did not know prior to having my third baby is magnesium and vitamin D are so important for bone health, immune function, and hormonal balance. And this is found in foods like those leafy greens, nuts, fortified foods, and even magnesium supplements, which I take daily now. And it has been a game changer for not only my hormones, but also my cortisol. It has lowered my cortisol, so that's that stress hormone. So that has allowed me to relax, and that has allowed me to be able to sleep better at night, to have more energy during the day, to not feel so tired and have that crash out period around 2 to 3 p.m. And people are probably going to roll their eyes at me, but having a schedule, having a routine, making the time to map out a routine, have consistency is so important, not only for your baby, but for you. To have that consistency is to keep your mind sane. Because before I had my third child, I don't want to say that I was in chaos, but I was not great about keeping a consistent or structured routine. I do now, and I'm very particular about how we do things, what we put in our bodies, what we do with our time, because all of that comes full circle back to your health, whether that's mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual health. It's all encompassed in one. And what you put in your body, what you allow in your life, whether that's postpartum or not, having a structured routine, having consistency, having an idea of what you feel helps you thrive in your life, which all kind of ties back into the thought process of if we are at our best for ourselves, we can be at our best to show up for our children. And that's why it is so important to take care of yourself through pregnancy, through postpartum, after postpartum. Just take care of yourself. You have to prioritize yourself, which is something that I've had to learn to do. I've had to learn to accept the help. I've had to learn to look into holistic health and take the supplements and get back on track and really try to heal my body, but also my mind and my spirit. That's all connected. The biggest thing that really helped me postpartum is exercising. And this really helped, even now, helps me balance my hormones and keep my hormones where they need to be, because endorphins released during exercise will help your mood stabilize out. So after this conversation that we've had, how do we normalize postpartum depression? It's crucial to understand that as a common treatable condition after having a baby, which is a trauma in itself, birth can be traumatic, pregnancy can be traumatic. It's not always a positive experience for every woman. And so I think that's very important to acknowledge. But asking for help or seeking that help with postpartum depression is not a sign of weakness. And it's important to encourage that open conversation about seeking help and about normalizing the symptoms and being able to talk about it, while also emphasizing the importance of seeking that professional help or medical help when needed. As I said before, 10 to 20% of women experience postpartum depression. Acknowledging that this is a real condition and it's a serious mental health condition that affects many women after childbirth, and that this is just not the temporary baby blues as we talked about in the beginning of the episode. This is something that is not anyone's fault. This is not something that a woman is doing on purpose. This is something that's a real condition that women need to have support for. And emphasize those support networks. Be a support to your friend. If your friend is going through that, or if you're going through that, seek that support network, because you don't have to go through this alone. And I think it's really important as a society to promote that open dialogue, encouraging women to talk about their feelings, their experiences, without having that fear of judgment or shame or that stigma surrounding postpartum depression, pregnancy, or even women's mental health in general. One thing that I did not even mention is postpartum depression can affect the baby. So advocate for improved access to mental health services for postpartum depression, postpartum just for women in general, and recognize that this can affect the baby, because if left untreated, postpartum depression can turn into postpartum psychosis, or even just postpartum depression can harm a person's health and lead to behavioral problems, developmental delays in infants, and understand that it can be a significant risk factor for future episodes of major depression. Even if this postpartum depression is treated, perinatal depression can be a risk for future episodes of depression. This does not only affect the mom and the baby, this affects the entire family. Children of parents who have untreated depression, whether it's postpartum depression or not, can develop behavioral and emotional problems and can experience an increase in stress within their own lives, especially if they're watching a parent go through a depressive episode. But what about those fathers who we talked about at the beginning of the episode with the paternal postpartum depression? That's, again, something I had never heard of. So raising awareness and education on postpartum depression for dads is so critical, especially in 2025, when we should be normalizing the fact that men also feel and have similar experiences or similar feelings that women can have during the postpartum period. I think as a society, we need to make it known that postpartum depression is not just a women's issue. Fathers can also experience that. They can experience guilt and shame around going back to work or providing for their family and leaving the mom at home to take care of the baby. They may be missing out on those times with their family, which can increase that depression or that anxiety. And I think that it's important to encourage research into the experiences and treatment preferences of fathers who have experienced paternal postpartum depression. But again, as a society, we need to be validating fathers. We need to be validating men in their feelings and creating a safe space for fathers to express their emotions. And mostly, I mean that in the relationship. It took me a long time to realize that I needed to stop making everything about myself and my feelings, and instead hear what my husband has to say and hear what my husband is feeling, which truthfully made all the difference in our relationship. And it's probably going to be controversial, but that's okay. I think we need to encourage fathers to be involved in their baby's care, which can help with that bonding and reduce the feelings of isolation. And like I said, encouraging them to be involved in their care. Fathers are not babysitters. A father cannot babysit their own child. So encouraging that involvement, having that family support, creating that support network within your relationship or your marriage, and having that help with childcare, housework, and other tasks together to reduce stress and allow fathers time for that self-care and that time for themselves is so important. I know that as a mom, I get very overwhelmed and very stressed. However, on the flip side, I see that my husband is feeling the same way. So it's important to validate his feelings and be able to support him, allowing him that time to have one-on-one time with his children and have that time by himself to kind of get back into a good headspace or take some time for self-care. That is so critically important. If, roles are reversed, men to women, women to men, it's important both ways for mothers and fathers to have time to themselves in their relationships or even with their children. And this really goes back to, addressing the barriers and the stereotypes that come along with this normalization of men and their mental health and women and their mental health, and normalizing that men and women both go through challenges, and acknowledging that men can experience emotional distress, and seeking help does not make them less masculine, and allowing them to have that space to open up and talk. Again, society makes it really difficult for men to seek that help, and they may be hesitant to open up due to that sense of self-reliance or that shame associated. So encouraging them to overcome that barrier. Again, it really all goes back to, if you're in a relationship, having that support system, having that validation, and being able to value one another in the relationship can make all the difference when going through the postpartum period, which also leads into the parenting in the future. I have never opened up about having postpartum depression. I have never opened up about having pregnancy rage or postpartum rage. I have never opened up about postpartum psychosis, which I briefly experienced. This has been a really informative and yet vulnerable episode for me, and I hope that I can make a difference in someone's life. I hope I can normalize an experience and be relatable, and I will see you later.